The wrecking crews arrived on Fifth Avenue in the autumn of 1926 with steam shovels and dynamite, and within 18 months they had erased the largest private house ever built in New York City, a 130-room limestone chateau that had taken Cornelius Vanderbilt nearly a decade and roughly $11 million to raise at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street. The family that commissioned it, one of the richest in American history, walked away from it without a fight, and a department store called Bergdorf Goodman opened on the site in 1928. Nobody forced them out. No creditor seized the property. The Vanderbilts simply decided the house no longer made sense, and they were not alone. Up and down the avenue, the same decision was being made by families with names like Astor and Gould. That single demolition is the doorway into a much larger mystery. If the Vanderbilts could afford literally anything on earth, why did they abandon the very house built to prove it? And where, precisely, did the richest families in New York go instead? Was there one new address that replaced Fifth Avenue, one gilded corridor that inherited millionaires' Rose crown? The honest answer is that there was no single address at all. The money scattered deliberately and unevenly across 5 boroughs, 2 neighboring counties, and eventually a state line, chasing tax law, new technology, private prejudice, and its own restless appetite for reinvention. Tracing that scatter block by block and county by county tells you almost everything about how New York's wealth remade itself in a single violent decade. To understand what was being abandoned, picture Fifth Avenue as it stood at the turn of the century, a corridor New Yorkers nicknamed Millionaire's Row, running roughly from the 30s past 59th Street into the 70s and 80s. It was a nearly unbroken wall of limestone and brownstone mansions, built by the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Goulds, and a dozen other dynasties whose names still sit on hospital wings and university buildings. A century later, carriages lined the curb outside townhouses with their own ballrooms, their own picture galleries, their own private chapels in some cases, all facing a park that had been engineered specifically to give those houses a view worth the price. This was wealth built to be seen, not banked quietly, and its whole logic depended on the avenue staying exactly as exclusive and exactly as residential as it was in 1900. This was the world Caroline Astor ruled from her ballroom, a woman so socially powerful that her arbiter, Ward McAllister, once declared that only 400 people in New York were worth knowing, a phrase, the 400, that stuck for a generation. Her power was not metaphorical. An invitation to her annual ball could make a family's social standing overnight, and its absence could end one. She held that throne for decades, and by the time she died in 1908, the pattern of dynastic houses marching up the avenue looked like the permanent, visible shape of American capital. It was not permanent. It was, in hindsight, closer to a high watermark. Her nephew's spite is part of the record, too. William Waldorf Astor, tired of his aunt claiming to be the only Mrs. Astor, built a hotel, the original Waldorf, right next to her house in 1893 for the specific purpose of devaluing her property and driving her out. It worked. She moved north to 855 Fifth Avenue instead, taking her throne with her, and the hotel he built out of pure family spite eventually merged with its rival next door to become the Waldorf Astoria, one of the most famous addresses in the world, born entirely out of a family feud over a single word, the. That kind of rivalry was survivable. What came next was not. The ratification of the 16th Amendment in 1913 gave the federal government its first peacetime income tax, and wartime finance during the First World War pushed the top marginal rate as high as 77% by 1918. Even after Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon's tax cuts through the Revenue Acts of 1921, 1924, and 1926 brought the top rate down toward 25% by mid-decade, the psychological damage was already done. Families who had built 40-room houses on the assumption of permanent untaxed income now had to think, for the first time in their lives, about the annual cost of running one. A mansion like Cornelius Vanderbilt II's required a live-in staff of dozens, coal delivered by the ton, and property taxes assessed on some of the most expensive real estate in North America, and none of that made sense once Fifth Avenue itself started changing beneath their feet. It was changing because the city around the mansions had become too valuable to remain residential. Retailers and hoteliers pushed steadily north from 34th Street, garment manufacturers crowded into loft buildings near the avenue, and property owners grew alarmed enough that in 1916 New York City adopted the first comprehensive zoning resolution in the United States, driven largely by lobbying from the Fifth Avenue Association, whose members wanted commercial encroachment controlled before it swallowed the corridor whole. The zoning law helped, but it could not reverse the underlying economics. Land under a private mansion was worth exponentially more as a hotel, a department store, or an apartment tower than as a single family's dining room. An entirely new kind of building was solving the problem of where the rich could live without either the tax burden of a mansion or the indignity of a hotel suite, and the story starts, oddly, underground. The electrification of the New York Central's rail approach into Grand Central Terminal, completed alongside the terminal's rebuilding between 1903 and 1913, meant electric trains produced none of the smoke that had made the old rail cut along Park Avenue unlivable. Engineers covered the tracks, and the real estate above them, and area developers called Terminal City, became some of the most desirable land in Manhattan almost overnight. Park Avenue, formerly an open rail trench lined with modest row houses, was reborn through the 1910s and 1920s as a canyon of luxury apartment buildings. The Pennsylvania Railroad performed a similar trick further west, but it was Park Avenue's transformation that mattered most to the families this story follows. The apartment cooperative, an idea that had existed in embryonic form since the 1880s, matured in the 1920s into the preferred housing of Manhattan's wealthiest families, and it solved almost every problem the mansion could not. A cooperative building let a family own a grand, servant-staffed home of 20 or 30 rooms without owning the plumbing, the roof, or the boiler, and it let a board of fellow residents control exactly who could buy in next door. Architects like Rosario Candela, a Sicilian immigrant who had arrived in New York as a teenager and trained at Columbia, became the signature designers of this new elite geography, producing towers like 740 Park Avenue in 1929, developed by James T. Lee, whose granddaughter Jacqueline would grow up to marry a president, 834 Fifth Avenue, 960 Fifth Avenue, and 720 Park Avenue. This cluster of buildings, raised almost entirely within a 5-year window, effectively replaced the architectural vocabulary of upper-class Manhattan in less than a decade. These buildings offered duplex apartments with private elevator landings, servants' wings, and gymnasiums, all while quietly performing the social function the old mansions had performed for free: exclusion. A cooperative board could reject a buyer for any reason it liked, and through the late 1920s many of them did, on grounds that had far more to do with religion and ancestry than with money in the bank. That exclusion reshaped the map of the entire city. Wealthy Jewish banking families, some of them among the richest people in the country, found themselves barred from many of the new Fifth and Park Avenue cooperatives regardless of their fortunes, and the response was to build a parallel geography of their own. Families like the Loebs, the Lehmans, the Warburgs, and the Guggenheims concentrated instead in stretches of Upper Fifth Avenue and along Central Park West, where within a few years architects like Emery Roth would raise towers, such as the San Remo, completed in 1930, whose twin towers still define the skyline over the park. The 1920s pattern of Manhattan wealth was never a single neighborhood, it was 2 or 3 overlapping ones, sorted as much by prejudice as by price, and the buildings still standing today on both avenues are the fossil record of that sorting. If any of these surviving buildings, the towers on Park Avenue, the Fortress Apartments on Central Park West, the Gold Coast ruins we are about to reach, are still standing near you, they are hiding in plain sight, behind ordinary addresses today, projected CTA, sentence 01. The rest of this story is about where the money went next, and why so much of it eventually disappeared. The demolitions kept coming. William K. Vanderbilt's own limestone chateau at 660 Fifth Avenue, nicknamed the Petit Chateau, came down in 1926. The Astor Mansion at 840 Fifth Avenue followed within roughly a year, torn down for a new apartment building. Vincent Astor, who had inherited the family fortune in 1912 at the age of 20 after his father, John Jacob Astor IV, died aboard the Titanic, became almost a symbol of the generational pivot underway across the whole class. Unlike his ancestors, Vincent showed little appetite for palace building. He spent decades instead liquidating and modernizing Astor real estate holdings, eventually redirecting family money toward housing reform and philanthropy through what became the Vincent Astor Foundation. The dynasty that had once defined Fifth Avenue by sheer architectural weight was, within a single generation actively dismantling its own monuments. But even as apartment towers rose on Park Avenue and Central Park West, a large share of the truly richest New Yorkers were not moving vertically at all. They were moving east out along the north shore of Long Island, into a stretch of Nassau and Suffolk County that newspapers and, later, novelists would christen the Gold Coast. It matters here to be precise about jurisdiction. Nassau and Suffolk are New York state counties, entirely separate from New York City's 5 boroughs, even though Brooklyn and Queens sit on the same physical island. When a Vanderbilt or a Guggenheim built an estate at Centerport or Sands Point in the 1920s, they were leaving New York City altogether, trading 5-borough taxation and 5-borough zoning for the jurisdiction of Nassau County and further east, Suffolk. The estates that rose there in the 1920s were built on a scale that made even the old Fifth Avenue mansions look modest. Otto Kahn completed Oheka Castle in the Cold Spring Hills near Huntington in 1919, a 127-room French chateau on 443 acres that was, at the time, the second largest private residence in the United States. Marshall Field III built Calmset on 1,750 acres at Lloyd Harbor between 1921 and 1925, a working estate with its own farm, stables, and private beach. William K. Vanderbilt II built Eagle's Nest at Centerport, a Spanish Revival waterfront retreat for his marine specimens and yacht trophies, and Frank W. Woolworth built Winfield Hall in Glen Cove. The Guggenheim family clustered at Sands Point, where Harry Guggenheim completed the Norman-style mansion Falaise in 1923, beside his father Daniel's earlier estate, Hempstead House. It is worth pausing on the writer who watched all this from the inside without ever quite belonging to it. F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda rented a house in Great Neck, Nassau County, from the fall of 1922 through the spring of 1924, and what he saw there, the new money of West Egg strained against the old money of East Egg, became the raw material for The Great Gatsby, published in 1925. It is important to be exact about what that novel is and is not. It is fiction, drawing loosely on real Long Island geography, not a documentary transcript of Great Neck society. But the underlying tension Fitzgerald dramatized was real, a genuine friction between fortunes 3 and 4 generations old and fortunes 5 years old that still smelled of the assembly line or the stock ticker. Further inland and further north, wealth took yet another shape, bound even more explicitly to New York State rather than New York City. In Westchester County, north of the Bronx line, John D. Rockefeller Sr. and his son had completed Kaikouit at Pocantico Hills in 1913, a 50-room stone mansion on grounds engineered by the Olmsted firm and by the 1920s Westchester's rolling hills, held a growing colony of estates for families who wanted proximity to Manhattan without any of its density, taxes, or zoning board. Scarsdale and New Rochelle were already transforming from farm towns into commuter enclaves, though the truly dynastic estates preferred more isolated ground further from the rail stations. Further estates, such as the Whitney's land in Old Westbury, blurred the line between Nassau's Gold Coast and Westchester's inland calm, showing that the boundary between these enclaves was never as clean as the county lines suggested. If Westchester offered privacy, Tuxedo Park, out in Orange County some 40 miles from the city, offered something closer to total seclusion. Founded in 1886 by tobacco heir Pierre Lorillard IV as a private hunting and leisure club ringed by an actual fence and gatehouse, it remained through the 1920s a self-governing enclave where membership, not money alone, determined whether you could even purchase land. It gave the American vocabulary its word for a formal dinner jacket, first worn there in the 1880s, and by the 20s it functioned as a country retreat, exclusively for families who had already proven themselves inside the tighter circles of the social register. Back inside the 5 boroughs, the geography of old wealth was fracturing along a different axis entirely, defined less by taste than by which fortunes had risen and which had stalled. Brooklyn Heights had been, in the 19th century, home to its own aristocracy of shipping and dry goods money, families like the Pierreponts and the Lows, but by the 1920s much of that wealth had migrated to Manhattan and Long Island, and many of the Heights' grand houses were subdivided into rooming houses even as the neighborhood kept its patrician reputation. The Bronx offered a different model in Fieldston and Riverdale, planned from around 1909 by the Delafield family as a wooded, privately gated enclave, but its residents tended to be prosperous professionals rather than dynastic capital on the Vanderbilt or Astor scale. And Staten Island carried a strange irony. Cornelius Vanderbilt himself had been born there in 1794 near Stapleton. Yet by the 1920s his descendants had entirely bypassed their own ancestral ground for Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue, and the Gold Coast. Put all of that together and the real answer to where New York's richest families actually lived in the 1920s comes into focus. And it is not one address but a map. They lived in cooperative towers on Park Avenue built atop covered railroad tracks that had been an open industrial wound only 15 years earlier. They lived in castles on Long Island's North Shore in a different county under different law, connected to their Manhattan offices by a private railroad and, for Vanderbilt's own descendants, a private highway. They lived behind the gates of Tuxedo Park and along the ridge lines of Westchester in jurisdictions chosen as deliberately as their architects. A smaller, excluded circle of equally wealthy families built an entirely parallel geography on Central Park West and Upper Fifth Avenue, because the co-op boards of Park Avenue would not have them regardless of their bank balances. And the neighborhoods that had once defined old New York wealth, Brooklyn Heights, Staten Island's North Shore, Lower Fifth Avenue itself, were left behind almost entirely. Their grand houses torn down, subdivided, or preserved only as fossils of a geography of money that had already moved on. The mansions did not come down because the money vanished. They came down because the money chasing tax law, technology, prejudice, and its own restless appetite for reinvention had already gone somewhere else. None of this reorganization happened in a vacuum of law and politics. Prohibition arrived nationally through the Volstead Act in January 1920, and it reshaped the social life of every one of these addresses without denting the flow of liquor into any of them. Families with existing wine cellars were legally permitted to keep and consume stock purchased before the law took effect, so old money quite literally drank differently from new money in the 20s, sipping through pre-prohibition reserves while paying for fresh champagne on the black market. Arnold Rothstein, the gambler and racketeer widely believed to have fixed the 1919 World Series, moved comfortably through both criminal and social circles, financing bootlegging operations while dining at tables that included men whose grandfathers had built the mansions now coming down on Fifth Avenue. The city's underside surfaced in tabloid form in June 1920, when Joseph Bowen Elwell, a socially prominent bridge expert, was found shot dead in his East 70th Street townhouse under circumstances never solved. In Manhattan itself, in the middle of the decade, the person who best embodied the fusion of political power and high society glamour was Mayor Jimmy Walker, elected in 1925 with strong backing from Tammany Hall, whose nightlife, tailoring, and speakeasy habits made him a fixture in exactly the entertainment world the wealthy frequented after dark. Tammany Hall itself had never controlled the old money families directly, its power base running through immigrant wards and municipal patronage rather than drawing rooms on Fifth Avenue. But by the 1920s, the line between machine politics and high society blurred at the edges, in shared nightclub tables, shared real estate deals, and a shared interest in zoning decisions that could make or break a fortune overnight. Walker himself would resign in disgrace in 1932 amid corruption investigations, one more sign that the glittering surface of 1920s New York concealed arrangements that could not survive sustained scrutiny. Behind every mansion demolished and every cooperative tower razed stood an enormous, largely undocumented workforce whose names rarely appear in the histories of who lived where. Italian stonemasons and craftsmen, many of them recent immigrants like Candela himself, built the limestone facades of Park Avenue's new apartment houses, often organized through building trades unions that staged real strikes in the early 1920s over wages and hours even as the buildings above them were marketed to the wealthiest families in America. The domestic workforce inside these homes was shifting too. The Irish and German servants who had staffed the 19th century mansions were increasingly joined and in many households replaced through the 1920s by black domestic workers who had arrived in New York as part of the Great Migration out of the American South, recruited through employment agencies clustered in Harlem, which by the mid-1920s was also flowering into its own cultural renaissance, even as many of its residents commuted daily to clean, cook, and drive for families who would never have permitted them to live as neighbors. The automobile itself created a wholly new servant class, the chauffeur, essential to any Long Island estate whose owner needed to reach a Manhattan office by 9 and a country club by evening. The wealth on display through most of this decade felt, to the families living it, permanent. It was not, on October 24, 1929, a Thursday remembered as Black Thursday, and again on October 29th, a Tuesday remembered as Black Tuesday, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed with a violence that erased fortunes built over generations within a matter of trading sessions. The consequences rippled outward through every neighborhood this documentary has traced. cooperative apartments on Park Avenue that had sold for staggering sums in 1928 and 1929 saw distressed sales and foreclosures through the early 1930s as owners could no longer cover maintenance fees, let alone mortgages. Out on the Gold Coast, estates that had taken years and millions of dollars to build began, over the following decade, to be sold off, donated, or simply abandoned. Some, like the Coe family's planting fields in Oyster Bay or the Guggenheim estates at Sands Point, eventually became museums, arboretums, and public preserves, monuments to a style of living the crash made financially impossible to sustain. Woolworth's Winfield Hall and Marshall Field's Comset underwent their own transformations, the former subdivided, the latter eventually passed into public parkland, following the same arc as their Gold Coast neighbors. Families who had seemed unshakably secure discovered that the same decade's tax policy, zoning law, and speculative real estate market that had built their world could, with equal speed, take it apart. Some of what the decade built did survive the reckoning intact. Rosario Candela's buildings on Park Avenue and Fifth Avenue remain, to this day, among the most sought-after cooperative addresses on earth, still governed by the same admissions boards, still capable of rejecting a buyer for reasons they are not required to explain. Oheka Castle, after decades of decay, arson, and near demolition, was eventually restored and now operates as a hotel and event venue, a private kingdom turned into a rentable backdrop for weddings. Candela himself died in 1953, largely unheralded outside architectural circles, having designed the interior geography of wealth for a generation that rarely bothered to learn his name. The durability was selective. Architecture survived far more often than the families who commissioned it. Stand today at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street, where the Vanderbilt Chateau's 130 rooms once stood, and you will find shoppers moving in and out of Bergdorf Goodman's doors, almost none of them aware that the ground beneath their feet once held the largest house New York City ever produced. Walk 2 blocks up Park Avenue and the lobbies of Candela's towers are still staffed, still guarded, still choosing their neighbors as carefully as any board in 1929. That is the real inheritance of the decade, not a single lost address, but a permanent restlessness built into the city's wealthiest geography, a habit of moving toward whatever the law, the technology, and the moment allowed, long after the family names themselves stopped being household words.